Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
If you could just please state your name and spell your last name for the jury.
Brian Tulley, T-U-L-L-Y.
Lieutenant Tully, you were testifying yesterday in some part about a search that you did in conjunction with the CERT team at 34 Fairview on January 29, 2022, correct?
Yes.
At any point in time, did you or any other member of your unit conduct any search of the residence at 34 Fairview Road?
No.
Why not?
We had no reason to believe there'd be evidence found within the home of 34 Fairview Road.
Lieutenant, inform the jury a little bit about search warrants as far as residences go and what is required in Massachusetts for you to conduct a search warrant.
Objection.
We haven't heard the question. Let's hear the question.
That was the question, I'm sorry.
I thought it was you informed the jury about search warrants and then what?
If I interrupted
Did you
you,
complete your question?
I did, Your Honor, yes.
Okay. It's sustained then.
thank you.
Lieutenant, over the course of your career, you've conducted search warrants of people's residences, correct?
Yes.
What do you need to do that?
A search warrant, consent, or exigent circumstance.
As far as a search warrant is concerned, what is necessary in order for you to get a search warrant?
Objection.
Jody, continue to be quiet. I'm going to allow him to build a foundation here.
As governed by the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and Article 14 of the Massachusetts Constitution, law enforcement is required to get a search warrant if we're going to invade someone's privacy. In order to obtain a search warrant, I need to gather facts that I swear an oath and affirm that are true and accurate, that there is probable cause, which means more likely than not that a specific piece of evidence will be found in a specific location and it's related to a crime. I need to check those boxes in order to obtain a search warrant through the trial court.
What information did you have related to specific evidence of a crime in relation to the interior of the residence at 34 Fairview Road?
I didn't have any. When thinking about residence and search warrants and evidence, I need to put the evidence inside the house. I don't believe that Mr. O'Keefe entered the home. I had no nexus to the house.
What evidence did you have that Mr. O'Keefe had ever entered the home at 34 Fairview Road on January 29th or on any other day?
I don't. On the contrary, I have evidence that he was outside, but I don't have anything putting him inside the residence.
You testified yesterday that at some point while you and the CERT team were conducting the search at 34 Fairview, that Sergeant Bukhenik and Trooper Proctor were following a tow truck with the defendant's vehicle from Dighton to the Canton Police Department, correct?
Yes.
In reference to taking the vehicle to the Canton Police Department, how was that decision arrived at? What other options did you have?
Sergeant Bukhenik and I had conversations. It was ultimately my decision of where the vehicle was going to go. We need to find a location that was secure, indoors, and preferably heated. We start going through checklists of what's available. You start thinking, obviously, of state police facilities. Between Dighton and Canton, where our office is as well, you have the Foxborough Barracks. I worked out of the Foxborough Barracks. The garage was probably not appropriate for that large vehicle to get in there. It's an old building. I worked at the State Police Barracks in Milton. That's even worse, with a smaller garage that's attached inside of an older building. The Canton Police Department was the next step. It checked all those boxes. It was inside, it was secure, and it was heated.
As far as your unit is concerned, from a staffing perspective, how is it that an investigation is conducted as far as certain roles, or can you speak a little bit about the roles that different people within your unit play with reference to an investigation just in a general sense?
Within the unit, we have different sections. We have the homicide section, narcotics section, and special investigations. Each is broken up into that. Obviously, the homicide section will undertake homicide investigations, but we work as a team. There'll be situations where you may need an all-hands-on-deck just to get some people out there. The narcotics folks will help with homicide investigations and vice versa. The homicide people will help with narcotics investigations when needed.
Specifically, when it comes to death investigation, there's someone who's assigned as what you call a case officer, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury what the role of the case officer is and what other supervision there is with reference to that case officer?
The case officer is essentially the central collection point for the investigation. They are the person that would gather the evidence, the records, hold those records, and then somebody needs to be held accountable for a to-do list or something to do. Supervisor would go to that one person, as well as the district attorney's office would know who to contact about a certain case, and then we'll go from there. Obviously, that case officer usually is a rank of trooper, especially when you're talking about unattended deaths. They have a sergeant and 2 lieutenants that are supervising them in that realm.
As far as interviews are concerned, what policy is there with regard to troopers and how many would be involved in the interview of any witness?
We would always have 2 people present, either a trooper and a local detective or 2 troopers. Just one ask questions, one take note-taking. It's just good practice.
And with respect to this investigation, the locals, as far as the Canton Police Department, was not something that you utilized, correct?
Correct.
Again, I know you testified a little bit about it yesterday, but if you could just reiterate or expound upon what your discussions were with the chief as far as Canton Police Department's involvement in this investigation going forward following the early morning hours of January 29th.
Our conversation circled around in the early hours about the homeowner of 34 Fairview, which was Brian Albert, has a brother, Kevin Albert, who was a detective with the Canton Police Department. Where we were, we had essentially zero information about the investigation. We wanted to remove any appearance of conflict by not having Kevin Albert or any of his coworkers involved in the investigation.
Was that in the investigation in its entirety, or the interviewing process, or how was that delineated, if at all?
No interviews. They were not involved in any discussion. Essentially, the entire investigation.
And as far as the case officer is concerned, is the case officer someone who, particularly in a homicide investigation, is as far as a decision regarding charging, is that something that the case officer would be tasked with?
No.
Turning your attention back to your testimony yesterday, there were items that you had retrieved from,
Yes.
as a precursor, if I could ask you, over the course of your career, specifically within the homicide unit with the district attorney's office, about how many death investigations, homicide investigations have you been involved in?
I would say in excess of 600 unattended death investigations that I personally investigated. That's not counting those phone calls, the calls I end up declining that I'd mentioned yesterday. In addition to that, I probably have either worked or supervised 75 homicides. Then getting back to the unattended deaths, I've supervised countless since I've attained the rank of sergeant and lieutenant.
With respect to your training and with respect to your experience, how many of those investigations have involved injuries which included abrasions?
Probably 10 to 20% of them.
If you could, at least from your understanding, if you could explain to the jury what your understanding of what is an abrasion. With regard to the items that you recovered on January 29th, there was one piece of clear plastic you testified yesterday had something.
Yeah, I may have used the word dimples, but yeah.
With respect to Mr. O'Keefe, at some point, did you have occasion to view photos of Mr. O'Keefe from the Good Samaritan Hospital?
Yes.
With regard to the items that you recovered, what significance did you observe between those items and the injuries that you observed to Mr. O'Keefe?
The injuries to Mr. O'Keefe, I noticed the abrasions had a certain pattern on them. I know that when a blunt force object is involved in causing an abrasion, the characteristics of the object that comes in contact with a person will often leave the characteristics on that person in the form of an abrasion.
With respect to this specific case, as far as any items recovered on January 29th and your observations of Mr. O'Keefe, what did you observe of any significance in relation to that?
I'd be comfortable in saying that the marks on Mr. O'Keefe are consistent with.
Objection.
Sustained.
Now, sir, if I could turn your attention, two other members of your units are troopers by the name of Trooper Dunn and Trooper Moore, is that correct?
Yes.
On February 2nd, 2022, are you familiar with them retrieving some video in relation to this investigation?
Yes.
Specifically from the town of Canton, did they retrieve video from there?
Yes.
Specifically, what location did they retrieve video from?
From the Canton Public Library at 786 Washington Street.
Are you familiar with them speaking with a gentleman by the name of Mr. Jutras?
Yes.
He's an IT person with the town of Canton.
He is.
As far as the timestamp with regard to the video that was retrieved from the Canton Public Library, what information do you have in reference to that?
Whenever we retrieve video, we want to ensure the timestamp is accurate, as we've learned, businesses are not always great about updating the timestamp. That's always top of mind when we collect video. Mr. Jutras assured us that the timestamp on the video was consistent and in real time.
Following day of February 3rd, you familiar with Trooper Moore retrieving some additional surveillance video?
Yes.
Where did he retrieve that video?
From Temple Beth Abraham in Canton at 1301 Washington Street.
As far as those two locations, as far as the Canton Public Library and the Temple Beth Abraham, are you familiar with where they are in relation to each other?
Yes.
Both located on Washington Street, is that correct?
Yes.
About how far away from each other are they?
About a mile and a half.
With reference to the Temple video, what information did you receive in regard to the timestamp on that video?
That was also accurate.
From each of these respective locations, what time frames was Trooper Moore in one instance and Trooper Moore and Trooper Dunn in the other instance? What time frames of video did they retrieve from each of those respective locations?
From 12 a.m. midnight to 1 a.m. and from 5 a.m. to 6 a.m.
Why was it that those were the timeframes, based on what you learned to that point in the investigation, why were those the timeframes that the troopers were looking for?
We had reason to believe that those were the times that Miss Reed's vehicle was traveling in and around that area.
We'll get to that a little bit more in a moment, but as far as reason to believe that Ms. Reed's vehicle was traveling in the area around those times, what information did you have to base that on?
We had statements and video from the Waterfall Bar and Grill, also on Washington Street, a little bit further down, the car departing in that direction. We had information about a car that matched her description arriving at 34 Fairview at a certain time shortly before 12:30 a.m. Like we always do, we do out a video canvas and look for video cameras from that first known point, which would be the Waterfall Bar and Grill, to the residence of 34 Fairview, and then from there, from 34 Fairview to 1 Meadows Ave, which was the home of John O'Keefe.
In reference to the morning hours between 5 and 6 a.m., the later morning hours between 5 and 6 a.m., what information did you have in relation to Ms. Reed's travel at that time?
We had learned through interviews that she was calling people as early as 4:45 in an effort to locate Mr. O'Keefe, a statement that she had left the house shortly after 5 a.m. We then know that she arrived at the McCabe residence on Country Lane after 5:30. We were trying to account for the movements of the vehicle for that 30-minute block.
In reference to phone calls, you've had occasion to review information related to the defendant's phone?
Yes.
And you mentioned that about 4:45 in the morning, she made phone calls allegedly trying to ascertain the whereabouts of Mr. O'Keefe. Is that correct?
Yes.
Prior to those 4:45 a.m. phone calls, were there other phone calls that the defendant placed?
Yes.
To whom did she place those calls and about what time?
Starting at 12:33 a.m. to 6:03 a.m., there were 53 phone calls from Ms. Reed to a phone number associated with John O'Keefe.
In addition to those phone calls to Mr. O'Keefe's phone, what other calls did the defendant make prior to those 4:45 a.m. calls?
There were phone calls to her family members, to Jennifer McCabe, Kerry Roberts, the Camaranos. Those are the ones that are off the top of my head. I have the notes in front of me if you want me to refer to them. After 6:03, when Mr. O'Keefe was found, there are a number of calls to members of John O'Keefe's family.
No, the phone calls to family members of her own, that defendant's family members, those were specifically to her mother and her father, is that correct?
Yes.
Did those phone calls precede the phone calls to either Ms. McCabe or Ms. Roberts or anybody else earlier that morning?
On the call detail records, they don't appear, but I know the phone dump has other information.
Your Honor, Lieutenant, turning your attention back to the videos we were speaking about, showing you recognize that?
I do.
What do you recognize that to be?
It is surveillance video from Temple Beth Abraham. It is a map I created with icons of the town of Canton.
How did you create that map, sir?
Using Google Earth as the mapping software, I placed icons on locations within the town of Canton that are relative to this investigation to provide better context and illustrate the area that we're going to be discussing.
Lieutenant, do you have the pointer before you again?
I do.
Using that laser pointer, if you could direct the jury's attention to the icons that you inserted in reference to various points of relevant locations, as well as any routes of travel or roadways depicted in this video.
Each icon is a house-shaped icon that I placed at different locations. The first one is red in color. It denotes where 34 Fairview Road is. Starting at the bottom, there is a pinkish color one that is the location of the Waterfall Bar and Grill. Just north of that, you'll see a brown one, which denotes the Canton Public Library. Following up this street here, which is Washington Street, you'll come to Temple Beth Abraham, which is denoted by the blue icon there. Then off to the right is 1 Meadows Lane with the green icon.
And if you could, just using that laser pointer again, note where the temple is.
It is the blue icon in the center of the map.
Now, as far as where the temple is located in reference to specific roadways, it's, you mentioned, located on Washington Street, correct?
Yes.
What roads intersect with Washington Street around the location of the temple?
Chapman Street is the street that runs in this direction towards Washington Street. Again, the Washington Street is this street here. It continues and stays Washington Street as it turns slightly east in that direction.
As far as available points of directionality or ways to travel roadways from the area of the temple, intersects in the area of Bukhenik, is that correct?
Yes.
As far as available routes of travel from the temple to 34 Fairview.
If one was at the temple and were to travel to 34 Fairview, you could continue up Washington Street, take the left onto Dedham Street, which is that street you just mentioned, a left onto Cedar Crest, and to enter that neighborhood down here. One could take a left and come down Chapman Street and take the right to enter the neighborhood in that direction, straight onto Fairview Road.
If you're approaching from the Chapman Street side of Fairview Road, as you come down Fairview Road, which side of the road would 34 Fairview be on?
Left.
Similarly, if you're approaching from the Cedar Crest side of Fairview Road and you turn on Fairview Road, which side of the street would 34 Fairview Road be on?
Right.
Thanks. With respect to each of these videos, as far as the Canton Public Library video and the Temple video, these are exterior cameras, is that correct?
Yes.
Orientation-wise, where do they focus on or where are they pointed at?
The ones that we focused on were the ones that captured Washington Street.
Are you aware of another location right around the area of Abraham called Cassie's?
Yes.
That's essentially like a convenience store, is that right?
Yes.
Were you or other troopers able to retrieve video from that location as well?
I don't believe so.
For orientation purposes, Lieutenant, if you could, using the laser pointer, just describe to the jury what we're looking at here directionality-wise and what you observe in this video.
The main street in the video is Washington Street. The Waterfall Bar and Grill would be off to the right-hand side, and Temple Beth Abraham would be off to the left. The intersecting road we're looking at here is Sherman, I believe.
If one were to take that right, if you're coming from the right of the screen to the left of the screen on Washington Street heading towards Sherman, and you were to take that right on Sherman, where does that take you?
You would head towards the neighborhood that 1 Meadows Ave resides.
Were you also able, over the course of the investigation, did you have occasion to look at surveillance video from the Waterfall Bar and Grill itself?
Yes.
From that video, were you able to determine a time at which Mr. O'Keefe was leaving from that establishment?
Yes.
What observations as far as time, or what observations did you make as far as what Mr. O'Keefe was doing or had with him when he left for?
When he left shortly after midnight, he was holding what appears to be a clear glass container.
Do you recall which hand he was holding it in?
His right.
Specifically, that was about 12 or 11 a.m., is that correct?
Yes.
Looking up at the screen now where it's paused, Lieutenant, what, if anything, do you observe there?
I observe a large black SUV here on Washington Street.
The large black SUV that you observed, is that consistent with what you've observed of the defendant's vehicle?
Yes.
If you could describe to the jury as far as when I asked Ms. Gilman to press play, what is that vehicle going into?
It's going to continue north on Washington Street through the intersection on Sherman and continue north on Washington Street.
What is in that directionality as it continues off of the screen to the left?
Be heading towards Temple Beth Abraham.
Good pause there, thank you. Again, for orientation purposes, Lieutenant, if you could describe using the laser pointer there as far as what we're looking at in this particular camera angle and shot, and as far as the roadways that you observe.
This is an exterior camera from Temple Beth Abraham at 1301 Washington Street. Where it's paused now at 1201, I believe is the timestamp, you see a vehicle. Here, that vehicle's traveling on Washington Street. We are now on the other side of Washington Street looking at it than we were from the library. The south and towards the waterfall, and the library would be off to the left. North would be off to the right.
As far as the time concerns, the video from the prior video from the library was about 12:15 a.m. when you saw the vehicle consistent with the defendants pass by that location?
Yes.
As far as this time that's up here now, approximately 12:17 or so, or somewhere within that minute between 12:17 and 12:18, is that consistent with the time it would take to travel from where the library is on Washington Street to where the temple is on Washington Street?
Yes.
From this particular time period around 12:17, between the minutes of 12:17 and 12:18, what did you observe of significance with reference to this investigation on this portion of this video?
At approximately 12:17 and 56 seconds, you'll see a large black SUV travel from left to right on the screen, which again would be northbound.
Again, left to right on the screen, just for orientation purposes, what is in the direction from left to right on the screen as far as of any significance to this?
As you continue north on Washington Street, you would, I believe the next intersection on the left is Dedham Street, which one could take to get to 34 Fairview Road.
I would ask you to direct your attention to the screen, and if you could, using the laser pointer, direct the jury's attention to what significance you observe in this portion of the video at 12:17:56 from the temple.
A large black SUV traveling northbound on Washington Street.
The large black SUV, is that consistent with the large black SUV that you observed in the prior video, Exhibit 110 from the Canton Public Library?
Yes.
Is that also consistent with what you observed as far as your personal observations of the defendant's vehicle?
Yes.
Lieutenant, direct your attention to up on the screen. This is the Canton Public Library video, again, Exhibit 110.
Yes.
As far as this is the time frame that you were talking about before, between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. that was done, and more retrieved from Mr. Jutras, correct?
Yes.
With reference to, as far as the conditions outside at this particular time between 5 and 6 a.m., what did you observe in this video?
The ground is now covered in snow.
Lieutenant, from this portion of this video from the Canton Public Library, what significance did you observe in this portion of the video relevant to this investigation?
You observe a large black SUV take a left from Sherman Street onto Washington Street, heading south.
And as far as the directionality from where that vehicle came from and the directionality where that vehicle is headed toward, what are the locations of significance are located in those areas?
Again, Sherman or Ave goes straight to 1 Meadows. If one were to travel from Meadows Ave, the residence of John O'Keefe, to this location here, you would come down Sherman and you could take a left onto Washington Street to head south.
As far as south on Washington Street, again, off to the right of the screen, what locations of significance in this case are located in that direction?
The Waterfall Bar and Grill.
As far as the black SUV that you observe in this video, is that consistent with the black SUV you observed in the Temple video from 12:17 a.m.?
Yes.
Is it also consistent with the black SUV that you observed in the library video from 12:15 a.m.?
Yes.
And is it also consistent with the defendant's black SUV?
Yes.
Are you familiar with Mr. O'Keefe's home having ring cameras affixed to it?
Yes.
Are you familiar with a video from those ring cameras depicting the defendant backing the black SUV out of Mr. O'Keefe's garage at approximately 5:07 a.m.?
Yes.
From that, as far as distance or time it would take to travel from Mr. O'Keefe's residence to this intersection covered by the Canton Public Library, from 5:07 to 5:11, now depicted on the screen, is that consistent with the time it would take to drive that, particularly given the conditions?
Yes.
Lieutenant, between these time frames of 5:11 a.m. and 5:15 a.m., at any point in time, do you observe the black SUV traveling back in the other direction?
Yes.
Specifically, around 5:15 and 51 seconds, what did you observe on this video of significance or relevance to this investigation?
A large black SUV will appear on the screen on the right-hand side and travel to the left-hand side, which again would be traveling north on Washington Street.
As far as, again, directionality, north on Washington Street to the left of the screen would be towards the Temple, is that correct?
Yes.
As far as operation, as far as directionality is concerned, what you observed in this area from 5:15 a.m., is that consistent with what you observed on the Canton Public Library video earlier at 12:15 a.m.?
Yes.
Again, as far as the black SUV that you observe in this, it's consistent with all the other black SUVs you observed in the video and the defendant's vehicle, correct?
Yes.
Lieutenant, if you could, using the laser pointer you have before you, direct the jury's attention to where you observed the black SUV.
Here on Washington Street, near the intersection.
Again, using that laser pointer, if you could, just indicate to the jury as far as directionality where this vehicle is going to head on this video.
North would be to the left-hand side of the screen, towards Temple Beth Abraham.
For the record, this is from Temple Beth Abraham video. This is from the period of 5:10 a.m. to 5:20 a.m., which is the second video listed down within. Now, Trooper, with regard to this video, at some point around 5:18 a.m., what did you observe of significance or relevance to this investigation from that period of the video?
A large black SUV travel left to right on the screen.
Again, as far as directionality, where would that vehicle be coming from and where would that vehicle be heading toward?
The left side of the screen would be in the direction of the Canton Public Library and the Waterfall Bar and Grill. Off to the right, again, would be the intersection with Dedham Street, which one could take to 34th Fairview.
As far as directionality, with reference to the earlier video from 12:17 a.m. from the Temple Beth Abraham, is directionality consistent in this video with what you observed at 12?
Yes.
What do you observe in this portion of the video relevant to this investigation?
A large black SUV traveling north on Washington Street.
Again, is that large black SUV that you observed here consistent with the large black SUV you observed in the prior videos and also consistent with the defendant's vehicle?
Yes.
Lieutenant, through the course of your investigation, are you familiar with what time it was that the defendant, approximately what time it was that the defendant arrived at Ms. McCabe's home?
5:35, approximately.
Ms. McCabe's home is located on Country Lane, is that correct?
Yes.
From the directionality of that vehicle in the 5:18 a.m. Video, as far as timing is concerned, 5:18 to about 5:35 or so, is that consistent with the time it would take to drive from that area of the Temple Beth Abraham to Ms. McCabe's residence on Country Lane?
No, not if you were to drive directly there.
To that point, as far as what about that time doesn't match up? Is it too short, too long, or something else?
It would take you much quicker to get there. It's about 1.5 miles from Temple Beth Abraham to Country Lane. You would continue north on Washington Street and just take a left into the Country Lane neighborhood. The time to travel, 1.5 miles.
From the distance between either that Temple video and either 34 Fairview Road or Country Lane, were you able to find, locate, or retrieve any surveillance video in those areas that would capture the vehicle?
No.
As far as you had mentioned earlier in your testimony, when we were talking about the earlier 12:17 a.m. portion from the Temple Beth Abraham video, the directionality of that black SUV, both in the 12:17 and the 5:18, where is Fairview Road in relation to the directionality of the SUV that you observed?
That SUV could take a left onto Dedham Street and then a left onto Cedar Crest to enter down to Fairview Road.
From your knowledge of the area as far as travel is concerned, would 5:18 to about 5:35 or so, would that allow for sufficient time to go from where it's viewable on the Temple Beth Abraham video for the vehicle to then travel to 34 Fairview Road and then travel to 12 Country Lane?
Yes.
I believe you had mentioned earlier in your testimony that at some point there were call detail records that were obtained in reference to the defendant's phone.
Yes.
With regard to call detail records and with regard to phones in general, what specialized training have you received or have you given in reference to those areas of focus?
I've received over 200 hours of training relative to obtaining and using call detail records and cell phone data in furtherance of criminal investigations. Most recently, I've given talks and seminars about the topic, and I've testified in numerous courts around the Commonwealth about the topic.
Can you explain to the jury detail records what they are and how you would use them as far as utility in, generally speaking, in reference to investigation?
Call detail records are business records held by cell phone companies, specifically to this matter, that are created in the normal course of business. Typically, you would think about in a billing context. If you think of your own cell phone bill, it would contain information like the date and time a communication occurred, the other phone number in which you communicated with, the duration of the call. That's bits of information. Obviously, as we're doing a criminal investigation, it's helpful to know with whom someone was communicating. Additionally, the cell phone companies memorialize other bits of information specific to what we refer to as CSLI, cell site listing information. They tell us the antennas that were used during the communication, usually just in the form of the first antenna and the last antenna. There are other engineering records that we can obtain that can be helpful when trying to determine where the handset cell phone was at any given time.
The handset that you refer to is essentially the phone itself, correct?
Yes.
With relation to the handset and its connection to antennas or towers, can you speak a little bit about that based on your training and experience with reference to how the handset communicates with an antenna and how it gets to a specific antenna?
Cell phone companies place antennas all around to help facilitate communication. You can think of a cell phone as really a two-way radio. It's sending and receiving radio waves. In order to facilitate that, cell phone companies place these antennas all around. Traditionally, you can think of them on a tower, but they can also be placed on the side of buildings or disguised as trees or just on top of light poles. They're all around, but you don't quite know it. As far as how the handset communicates with the antenna, there are different variables that go into that. Now, the cell phone wants to connect to the antenna with the strongest signal. The best predictor of a strong signal is distance. The further a radio wave travels, the more it's going to degrade and not be as strong. But there are other factors that can degrade or reduce the strength of a radio wave, specifically an obstruction. If you're in a basement of a building or standing behind a large brick wall, the radio waves aren't going to penetrate that as well. But even things like precipitation or foliage on a tree can also hinder it. You think about rolling hills here in Massachusetts in tall buildings, they can also disrupt radio waves.
As far as that disruption of radio waves, are you familiar with certain areas that get sort of termed as a dead zone?
Yes.
Can you explain what your understanding of that term is as it relates to what you've been talking about as far as the handset communicating with the antenna?
I would define a dead zone as an area where there's not good cell phone coverage. So the antennas are not covering that area for whatever reason, obstruction, the density of the tower. Oftentimes, an antenna can only handle so many cell phones at a time. It's an idea that we coin or refer to as load. There's only a certain number of devices that can handle an antenna. My best analogy of that is Gillette Stadium. I've worked at Gillette Stadium detail many times. We have roll call for Patriots game early in the morning. I take my post. I have strong functionality of my cell phone. As hundreds of thousands of devices are now entering the area around Gillette Stadium, the functionality of my cell phone reduces as more devices are using the antennas in that area.
With respect to the cell phone companies themselves, they create or utilize this data for their own business purposes, correct?
Yes.
Can you just briefly explain a little bit about what the cell phone companies would be using this kind of data for as far as what you're talking about, connections to antennas and towers?
It's a company who wants to make money, so it's going to memorialize things to bill their customers appropriately. They're also required by the FCC to keep, for a certain period of time, certain records because they are a communications provider. There are some requirements, regulatory, that they need to fulfill.
As far as the information that you're able to these call detail records, I believe you've spoken a little bit about, but as far as what, if any, limitations are there with reference to the information you're able to glean from the records?
Well, the overarching one is I can only get what I get. So whatever the company sends me, that's what I can use in my determinations. The next step is when we're talking about antennas, I will never, well, I'll have difficulty saying exactly where a cell phone was when using an antenna. I can make generalizations that the phone is going to be in the area of the antenna, but I would never, with just that specific information, be able to tell you exactly where it is. I can look at other records, like the engineering records, where, especially now with 4G and 5G technology, the cell phone providers need to know how far away a handset is from the antenna in order to facilitate that communication. And they keep those ranging records for me. If I can obtain those records, I can then place a much narrower area where a cell phone would have been during a time period.
In reference to this investigation, you search warrants that Trooper Proctor did with regard to call detail records from Ms. Reed's phone, correct?
Yes.
Were you able to, did you have occasion to look at those call detail records?
Yes.
I'm showing you a full-page document. Do you recognize that document, sir?
Yes.
What do you recognize it to be?
It is the subscriber information for the phone number ending in 9554.
Who did you find that number to be associated with?
The defendant, Karen Reed.
With respect to the documents before you, that has some listing of account information, is that correct?
Yes.
Who is listed as the subscriber for that account with phone number ending in 9554?
Karen Reed of 481 Gilbert Street in Mansfield, Massachusetts.
In the course of your investigation, familiar with that address of 481 Gilbert Street?
Yes.
Is that the residence of the defendant?
Yes.
I'm actually going to see counsel outside that for just a minute.
As far as the information that you receive with reference to call detail records, is there a section called the records key?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury what a records key is and how you use that in order to facilitate or read the records?
The records key give us the definitions of terms that are used in the record. The record comes usually in the form of a spreadsheet or PDF. You'll get columns and rows. The columns will be named certain things. Those titles are often specific to the company. I want to make sure that I'm reading and understanding what the data is.
Describe to the jury what your understanding of the term as far as cell site listing information and how that's used in an analysis of call detail records.
CSLI, as it's referred to, has that billing information, time, date, duration, other phone number, and it has the antenna used during the communication. Just as it says, it's a cell site, which is another other term for antenna, as I usually use.
Sir, through your training experience, are you familiar with the term in reference to this type of material called ranging data?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury what you understand that term to mean and how it's used in interpretation of call detail records?
The ranging data goes back to the engineering reports I had mentioned earlier that can provide more information. They can tell me the antennas that were used during communication. It can tell me the range in which the handset was away from the antenna. Now, opposed to just making general determinations where a handset was near an antenna, I now have a range. I will plot the location of the antenna, measure out that distance, and draw an arc with that radius of the distance on a map. And I can make an assumption that the handset is somewhere on that arc. The ranging data is also helpful because the user does not need to be actively using the phone in order for a record to be created. Right? The billing record is going to be a phone call made or received, text message made or received. A cell phone as it sits today is still communicating with the antenna. You're getting notifications, it's checking email, it's updating, and because it's utilizing the network, your cell phone provider is capturing that data and it's generating a record, even though unbeknownst to the user.
To that point, or illustrative of that point, so if I'm standing right here with the cell phone in my pocket, not using it, not turning it on, not activating it in any way, that cell phone is still doing some communication with the closest or some antenna within the vicinity?
Yes.
Are you also familiar with a term called UTC, or Universal Time Code?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury what that term means and how it relates to these types of records?
UTC, or now known as Coordinated Universal Time, is the time zone along the prime meridian. If you think of the globe, you got longitude and time zones. The prime meridian is a spot that runs through Western Europe and Western Africa. That is the line in which all time zones around the world are predicated. UTC would be a time there, and it's not determined by daylight savings time either. All those time zones, like I said, around the globe are predicated on that. Because it's one standard time in a globe, a lot of records will come in UTC time, and you have to make the conversion. They will provide records specific to a cell phone, what time it was locally, but it will tell me what the UTC time was. For me to figure out what the time was locally during the time of the communication, I got to do the conversion.
To that point, as far as the conversion is concerned, what type of conversion are we talking about?
Here on the eastern side of the United States, it's -4 hours during the summer and -5 in the winter.
As far as these records are concerned, I believe you spoke a little bit as far as the arc and plotting, but if you could expound upon that as far as explain to the jury what it is exactly you're able to do with the information from the call detail records as far as a visual representation.
You said two things there, so I want to make sure I answer the question right. You mentioned ranging data, but CSLI, so specific to the engineering report in ranging, or CSLI?
Let's first start with CSLI.
With the CSLI, I will place on a map the location of the antenna. I mentioned load a little bit, but that load factor determines on how dense the antennas will be placed by the provider. If you think of an urban environment, there's more cell phones, there's more devices that need antennas. The locations of the antennas will be more dense. I've seen them as close as 100 yards away from each other in an urban environment. You come out to the suburbs, there are less devices. The companies are going to put less antennas because they don't want to put them up where they don't need to. They're going to be further away. In Norfolk County, the antennas are placed anywhere from 1 mile to 4 or 5 miles apart.
There would be a difference as far as the amount of antennas, the amount of towers, like say in the town of Canton versus downtown Boston.
Yes.
Again, I think it's pretty clear, but which of those two, as far as downtown Boston or the town of Canton, would have more antennas or more towers for a cell phone to connect to?
Downtown Boston would have more.
With relation to the number of antennas or towers that a handset or a cell phone could connect to, what relation does that have to geographic location, or what you're able to glean in reference to geographic location from the call detail?
Once I place the antenna on a map, I will look at where the other antennas are. I can make a general determination that the cell phone was closer to that antenna than other antennas. Again, there's the caveat, and I'll say it up front, is that there are other mechanisms that could prevent it from connecting to the closest tower. But generally, it's going to connect to that closest tower. Now, there are redundancies built into the system. If an antenna goes down because it gets struck by lightning or it needs service, there are other antennas nearby that can cover an area.
Now, with respect to the CSLI data, were you able to do that in this case as far as plotting that on a visual representation on a map?
Yes.
They're showing you, I believe it's a 10-page document, just ask you to review that, look up when you're finished. Do you recognize that, sir?
Yes.
What do you recognize that?
It is a series of maps that I created depicting the records obtained from that number ending in 9554.
That's plotted onto a Google image or a Google Earth image?
I use Google Earth to create the maps. I then take a screenshot and place it typically in PowerPoint in order to make it look nice.
Do you recognize what's depicted now up on the screen? Yes. And what do you recognize this to be?
It is a map that I created using the information from the call detail records, or CSLI, from that account.
And from what time period of the call detail records are we looking at particular?
12:33 a.m. to 12:34 a.m. Again, I had done the conversion for the purposes of making this exhibit. If one were to look at the call detail records, you may see the UTC time. For the convenience, I've done the conversion for the purposes of the exhibit.
Sir, if you could, using the laser pointer, before you direct the jury's attention to what, if anything, of significance you've plotted out and put into this visual representation.
So first, we're looking at the area of different landmarks, again, to give context to what we're talking about here. You see 34 Fairview Road. yellow house icon, have Canton as a darker color, and the Waterfall Bar and Grill as another icon. Now, off to the left, just west of Route 95, which you'll see running here, you'll see a red triangle, which I use consistently as the antenna, and a series of letters and numbers next to them. Next to them is the numbering system that Verizon assigns to that antenna. In this instance, we're looking at ENB, which is the antenna acronym, specifically 57171.
To be clear, as far as that marking with the red triangle, that is the antenna that the handset or the defendant's cell phone is connecting to at that point, correct?
Yes, and I always try to be clear, that is the antenna. That's not where I'm saying the handset was.
The handset is somewhere in that vicinity based on your training experience, is that correct?
Yes.
Sir, what time period are we looking at in this particular representation?
12:35 to 12:37 a.m.
Again, if you could, using the laser pointer before you, direct the jury's attention to what, if anything, relevance you did in this representation.
So icons appear as about the locations relative to this investigation. You'll see another red triangle here close to Route 95, which is NEB ID 56. During this time period, the handset associated with this account communicates with that antenna.
From the location, significance, or relevance as far as ENB ID 57, which of them is it closest to in this depiction?
It's just north of 34 Fairview Road.
If I could direct your attention. And Lieutenant, what time frame are we?
This comes from one call that occurred at 12:38 a.m.
As far as you could, again, using the laser pointer, direct the jury's attention to what other locations have you identified or signified in this representation?
Again, same icons further south at the bottom. The antenna is located here at the intersection of Route 93 and 138, and it's ENE ID 57021.
Of those locations of interest that you signified within this ENB ID 5 relation to those.
If you think back to the previous slide, so now we've moved a little bit further east. Here's Fairview Road, and here is 1 Meadows Ave.
What time frame are we looking at in this?
12:39 a.m. to 5:08 a.m.
Again, if you could, using the laser pointer, direct the jury's attention to what, if any, location note in this slide.
So there were a series of calls during this time period. They all used this antenna here, EID 57199, which is south of Meadows Ave.
If I could direct your attention to the next slide, please. If I could have that one, please. Lieutenant Tully, what are we looking at as far as time frame in this particular, using the laser pointer, if you could direct the jury's attention to what locations you denoted within this particular slide.
I'll start with the antenna that was used, which was 57259 here in downtown Canton, just north of the Waterfall Bar and Grill.
Lieutenant, what time frame is that depicted in this?
5:19 a.m.
Again, if you could, using the laser pointer, direct the jury's attention to where the antenna is that the defendant's phone is connected to at this point and what it is closest.
Slightly further south than the previous one, it's 57199, directly south of 1 Meadows Ave.
Now, I could ask you to turn to the next slide. Lieutenant, what time frame are we looking at in this?
5:20 a.m. to 5:37 a.m.
Again, if you could, using the laser pointer, direct the jury's attention to where the antenna is and what of the locations you observe it, where it is in reference to those.
I previously mentioned this one here at the intersection of Route 93 and 138. It's ID 57021. It's north of those locations I had mentioned earlier, the 34 Fairview and 1 Meadows.
The next slide. What time frame are we looking at in this, sir?
It's one entry at 6 a.m. from the record.
Could, again, using the laser pointer, direct the jury's attention to the antenna.
It is located just north of the Waterfall Bar and Grill in downtown Canton.
The next slide, sir. What time frame are we looking at in this slide, sir?
6:03 to 6:57 a.m.
Again, using the laser pointer, if you could, direct to which antenna the defendant's cell phone is connected to at this point and where it is in relation to locations of significance or throughout the course of this investigation.
During this time period, the cell phone will bounce back and forth between two antennas. So I did lump them together, place them on one map with this time frame here. You will see two antennas. One is this one here, just west of Route 95, which is 57171. The other antenna is north of 34 Fairview, which is 57286.
Sir, as far as the locations that you observed from looking at the information from the defendant's phone, any relationship did you note with them in relation to what you had observed on each of the respective videos from the Canton Public Library and the Temple Beth Avery?
It's consistent. As with anything in our investigation, we want to get corroborating information. The best corroboration about the location of a handset is to obtain video, receipts, anything else with a timestamp and a location that we can corroborate the location of a handset.
With respect to information that you had received as far as the defendant's whereabouts, what consistency or corroboration was there between witness accounts of the defendant, including the defendant's own statements, as far as where she was and what you retrieved from the CSLI?
Objection.
Ask it differently, Mr. Riley.
Throughout the course of the investigation, were you made aware of the path of travel attributed to the defendant both between the hours of 12, between the times of 12 a.m. and 6 a.m.?
Yes.
The information that you obtained from the CSLI records, was that consistent with what you knew as far as the location of the defendant?
Objection.
Ask it differently, Mr. Riley. The objection is sustained.
With respect to what you knew as the path of travel of the defendant, the information that you obtained from the CSLI, what relationship was there between that and the path of travel you knew of the defendant?
It's consistent.
Sir, as far as the ranging data, what were you able to do with the ranging data in relation to a visual depiction of that?
Similar to the maps we just saw using Google Earth, I made a visual representation of what the records display, specifically where the antenna is, but I took that additional step to measure the distance out from the antenna that's depicted in the records and draw a semicircle line depicting where that range would lie.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
Pages. Ask you to look at that in 5 years. Do you recognize those documents, sir?
Yes.
And what do you recognize those to be?
The series of maps I created using the ranging or engineering report.
What you have before you as Exhibit 576, the second page in, is that what's up on the screen, Lieutenant?
Yes.
If you could, again, what time frame are we looking at here?
12:17 a.m.
And, sir, if you could, using the laser pointer, describe to the jury what's depicted in this particular slide.
So locations that are, again, as a frame of reference, 34 Fairview Road in Canton and the Waterfall Bar and Grill are depicted with icons. You'll notice a red lollipop would be the best description icon here. Next to it, you see a number and the words either first or last. This one, 3, first or in last. If you were to go back to the record or the ranging report, you would go to line 3. That's where you would find this record, which is an easy way to cross-reference the map with the document. With these ranging reports, it gives me the range that the handset was from the antenna at the beginning of the communication and at the end of the communication. That's the first range and the last range. That's why we're using those words. You'll notice a line that goes straight out to the semicircles. That line denotes what's called the azimuth, and I've failed to describe what an azimuth is. As antennas are placed in these locations, they're pointed in a direction. They're not typically a 360-degree antenna. Some are, but mostly they're not. They're pointed in a direction and have a beam width. Rule of thumb, and as you'll see with the records with Verizon, it says typically it's 120-degree beam width because they'll place 3 around a circle and you get 360 degrees. With this record here, I know what the azimuth is. I then draw a semicircle in each direction. I'll go beyond that 120 degrees just to give deference to maybe it was on the outer edges of that. I want to give the tie to it was maybe further away. That's what's depicting on the map.
With reference to the semicircle itself, if I could ask, is the semicircle that is being drawn, what does that exactly denote as to the location of the handset or the cell phone?
The report is telling me that the handset is somewhere on that semicircle. The phone could be anywhere from here on the semicircle all the way around to there on the semicircle.
Again, it's not denoting that the handset or the phone is within the confines of the semicircle, but actually on the line that you've drawn.
Correct.
With reference to what's up on the screen now, Lieutenant, what time frame are we looking at here?
5:18 a.m.
Again, if you could, using the laser pointer before you, draw the jury's attention or direct the jury's attention to what is significant you observe in this.
The 2 icons are, again appear on the map, Waterfall Bar and Grill, 34 Fairview Road. Here is that red lollipop, which is the antenna that's used during the communication. The azimuth, or the direction in which the antenna is facing, is depicted on there, and 2 semicircles. The first one and the last one. As a frame of reference, I failed to put the Temple Beth Abraham, which would appear right here.
From this, what's depicted in these last 2 exhibits as far as what you're able to plot out from the CSLI and the ranging data, what significance did that have as far as in reference to the investigation and the handset or the defendant's phone?
It's important to figure out the movements of someone that we're investigating for a crime. These ranging records really narrow down the scope of they're somewhere around this antenna to it's possible they were somewhere on this line. Again, these records are just depicting where the handset was, but as we all know, we all travel with our cell phone within arm reach.
Again, it's in reference to this, what relationship did you find that to have with other information being videos and witness statements that you obtained during the course of the investigation?
As we previously showed, Temple Beth Abraham, which would be located here, just south of this intersection here, depicts a large black SUV traveling north on Washington Street. That SUV is similar to the defendant's. With this record here, a phone associated with the defendant was somewhere on this arc at that exact same time.
Thank you, sir. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Good morning.